He was born without announcement in a world that wasn't watching. No thunder, no star in the sky, no angelic choir. Just the cry of a child in the early 1900s in a village nestled near the ancient ruins of Elefsina, sacred ground once defiled by pagan mystery rites, now blessed with a new kind of mystery, the kind that wears worn sandals and whispers instead of shouts. His name at birth was Evangelos Byracterus, just a village boy, son of a poor family, with no prophetic aura to suggest the immense spiritual flame that would one day burn quietly within him. That's how it often is with saints. They begin not as warriors or kings, but as whispers in history. And St. Porphyrios' whisper would one day become a lifeline for thousands of souls lost in noise. What sets his story apart isn't just the visions or miracles. It's how invisible he was while being so deeply connected. As a child, he didn't chase greatness. He dropped out of school early to help support his family. Poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a formative teacher. Imagine being a boy of just 7 or 8, walking barefoot along muddy paths to earn a few coins to bring home. There's no prestige in that. But there's something else. Humility. Hiddenness. The kind of silence that echoes in heaven. As he grew, so it didn't ache, a hunger not for food or wealth, but for something holy, something eternal. He first heard about the desert fathers of Mount Athos from a book, and like a match meeting dry kindling, the stories of those monks set his soul ablaze. Not later. Now. He couldn't wait. He was 14 when he ran away from home and made the dangerous journey to the holy mountain. 14, an age when most are barely beginning to understand the world. He was seeking to renounce it entirely. He arrived in Kafsokalivia, a rugged hermitage clinging to the cliffs of Mount Athos. There, he met 2 elder monks who saw in him something rare. Not just zeal, but purity. And in that hard, rocky wilderness, where the wind howled and prayers outnumbered words, Porphyrios was remade, not polished into something shiny. No, he was worn down by obedience, silence, and pain. He didn't seek visions. He didn't ask for gifts. But in surrendering his entire being, God gave him something the world can't manufacture. Spiritual sight, the ability to see, not with eyes, but with the heart. That's where the mystery of Porphyrios deepens. There are stories, true stories, of how he could perceive a condition of a person's soul before a word was spoken, of how he would know the disease in a man's body or the torment in a woman's heart. Even across continents, a man once came to visit him, suffering from a complex psychological trauma that no doctor could understand. Porphyrios listened, looked at him quietly, and then spoke, not with analysis, but with divine tenderness. He told the man his exact childhood experience that had caused the wound. The man wept, not because of the diagnosis, but because he was seen. And that's what Porphyrios did. He saw people, deeply, not with judgment, but with the love of someone who understood the abyss of human suffering, because he had walked it himself. He carried his own illnesses silently. Sickness plagued him throughout his life. Severe health issues, blindness in one eye, and eventually cancer. But he never asked God to take it away. He saw it as a companion, not a curse, a crucible. And that's something the modern world struggles to understand. We flee from pain. We numb it, silence it, cover it with distractions. But Porphyrios leaned into it. He offered to God and, in doing so, found something we all long for, peace that surpasses understanding. But don't mistake his holiness for aloofness. He had joy, real human joy. He laughed, loved to sing Byzantine hymns with tears in his eyes, delighted in nature, and welcomed all who came with questions, whether they were simple villagers or university professors, rebellious youth or weary elders. To each he gave the same gaze, unhurried, fully present, full of divine affection. This is a paradox of Porphyrios. A monk who hid in the shadows of society, but radiated a light so powerful, it reached the heart of Athens. People would line up just to speak with him for 5 minutes, not because he had trendy answers, but because he carried something sacred, presence, the presence of someone who had emptied himself so fully that Christ himself could shine through every word, every silence. And yet, despite his fame in later years, he never wanted to be seen as a miracle worker. He called himself a worm. He never claimed credit. He deflected praise. The more people tried to glorify him, the more he tried to disappear. That wasn't false modesty. It was truth, because he had seen the heights of divine glory. And when you've glimpsed that, you know how small you truly are. That's why this story doesn't begin with fireworks. It begins in silence. Because Porphyrios' life wasn't a spectacle. It was a seed buried in the earth of pain, watered by tears, and grown under the hidden light of grace. And that seed, it would grow into a tree whose branches would give shade to thousands. More than a monk, more than a mystic, Porphyrios was proof that sanctity doesn't need a spotlight, that the most extraordinary lives are often lived in obscurity, that God still speaks, but only the quiet ones hear. That's the hidden light, and it's only the beginning. What does it mean to see? Not with the eyes that scan billboards or flick through screens, but with something far more ancient, far more dangerous. The kind of sight that doesn't stop at the surface but goes straight to the soul, uncovering what even we try to hide from ourselves. That's the kind of vision St. Porphyrios had. It wasn't earned through study or intellect. It wasn't conjured by ascetic extremes or mystical rituals. It came quietly, as grace often does, carried on the back of obedience, prayer, suffering, and silence. He never chased spiritual gifts. In fact, he once said that chasing gifts is like climbing a tree from the wrong end, starting with the branches instead of the roots. But when God opened Porphyrios' spiritual eyes, it wasn't for his own glory. It was for the broken, for the confused, for those standing on the edge of darkness, not knowing they were loved. And his sight, it was terrifying in its precision. A woman once came to see him, smiling politely, hiding a deep, festering wound behind her eyes. Before she could say a word, he gently told her the exact situation she was struggling with. Not a guess, not vague spiritual jargon. He described a moment she had never spoken aloud, when she was a child, alone in a hospital, afraid and abandoned. The moment she learned not to trust anyone. Her face crumbled, but Porphyrios didn't shame her. He spoke of that moment not as an outsider, but as someone who had been there in spirit, who had seen her suffering when no one else did. Another man, skeptical and proud, once walked into his room, more out of curiosity than faith. Before he could introduce himself, Porphyrios looked at him and said, "You shouldn't be here, not because I don't want you, but because you came to test me. And that's not what this is." The man froze. The curtain dropped, and so did the act. He sat down and began to weep. Porphyrios had this way of disarming people, not with force, but with love so precise it left no room for masks. He didn't expose people to humiliate them. He revealed their pain to heal them, to set them free. And this is what modern minds often miss when they hear about clairvoyance or spiritual gifts. They reduce it to spectacle like a psychic trick. But for Porphyrios, it was a burden. Do you know what it's like to feel the pain of everyone who enters the room? To see their past, their spiritual sickness, their secret addictions, not as rumors, but as lived realities inside your soul? He bore all that, daily, not for admiration, but because that's what love does. It suffers with. He once said that true love is to carry the burden of the other person's pain as if it were your own. And that's exactly what he did. His spiritual sight wasn't separate from his suffering. It was because of it. His own health was fragile for most of his life. He battled illness after illness, each one gnawing at his body like a silent predator. He could have prayed for healing. Many did, but he refused to ask for relief. Christ did not come to remove suffering, he once said, but to fill it with his presence. That's what Porphyrios believed. That pain wasn't a punishment. It was a passage, a holy path that made the heart soft enough to hold others. In fact, he believed that suffering purified the spiritual senses. That without suffering, love remains shallow, theoretical. But when your body fails you, when you're reduced to silence, when you have nothing left but God, you begin to see, not because you become powerful, but because you become nothing. And in that nothingness, God fills you with himself. This was the paradox of Porphyrios. The sicker he became, the more radiant his spirit grew. The less he could physically do, the more spiritually effective he became. He could barely walk, yet traveled continents in prayer. He could barely see with his earthly eyes, yet perceived the deepest secrets of the soul with piercing clarity. One of his spiritual children once said, "When he looked at you, it was like standing in front of a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your essence." There was no hiding, but there was no fear either, because to be seen by Porphyrios was to be seen through the eyes of God, with absolute truth and absolute mercy. He didn't just see sins. He saw the scars behind the sins, the loneliness behind the addiction, the trauma behind the rage. And he knew how to speak directly into that wound, not with theology, but with presence. That's what people came for, not for miracles or prophecies. They came to be seen, fully, and still loved. And he didn't just wait for them to come. Porphyrios would often say he saw the whole world as one single organism, interconnected in Christ. That's how he could sit in his small, dark room and pray for someone in Australia and feel their healing, as if it were happening in his own body. He believed in a deep mystical communion, that love knows no distance, that prayer is not shouting into the void, but stepping into another soul's, suffering and bringing Christ there with you. To him, this wasn't poetry. It was reality, a reality that bled to the veil of ordinary life. He once said, "God made us to be gods by grace." That's not arrogance, it's destiny. A destiny forgotten by most of us, buried under distractions and noise. But Porphyrios hadn't forgotten. And that's why he could see not just the pain, but the potential. He saw who you were before the wound, before the lie, before the compromise. And he reminded you, he saw with the eyes of God. There's a strange kind of joy that doesn't come from anything the world can give. It's not the happiness of getting what you want or the relief of a burden lifted. It's not tied to comfort, success, or even healing. It doesn't rise and fall with circumstances. It comes from somewhere deeper, under the surface, where pain meets purpose and sorrow finds its voice in song. That was the joy of St. Porphyrios. If you had visited him in the last years of his life, you might not have known he was sick. He wouldn't tell you, not because he was trying to be stoic, but because he didn't want to burden anyone with his suffering. He would ask how you were doing. He would smile. He would laugh. He would sing. The pain in his body was real. Cancer, blindness, years of illness that slowly ravaged his strength. But it never took his joy. If anything, it made it brighter. He once said, "Whoever wants to become a Christian must first become a poet." And that wasn't some abstract metaphor. For Porphyrios, Christianity wasn't a rule book or a survival tactic. It was a song, a melody that could be heard in the rustle of trees, the silence of prayer, the laugh of a child, the ache of a wound. Life, even when broken, was beautiful. And God, always present, even in the dark, was beauty itself. That's why his joy wasn't escapism. It wasn't denial of pain. It was rooted in reality, a deeper reality. He said, when you love Christ, even the pain disappears. And people misunderstood that. They thought he meant the pain goes away. But he didn't mean that. He meant that when love becomes your whole being, pain no longer defines you. It no longer controls you. It becomes a thread in the tapestry, not the whole story. He loved the world, not in the worldly sense, but in the purest sense. He could look at a leaf trembling in the wind and weep at the beauty of God's design. He loved birds. He loved sunlight. He loved people, even the ones who rejected him, especially the ones who were wounded. There's a story of a young man who came to Porphyrios, angry, rebellious, full of contempt for the church. He mocked the idea of saints. He said religion was for weak minds. Porphyrios didn't argue. He didn't quote scripture. He just smiled and said, "I love you," and he meant it. The young man said later that in that moment, everything in him cracked open, because he had never in his life been loved without conditions. That's the kind of joy Porphyrios carried, a joy that disarmed people not by force, but by presence, a joy born from intimacy with Christ, not just in the resurrection, but in the cross. His life was saturated with suffering. As a young monk, he once stood praying in the freezing rain for hours, weeping for the world, not because he was told to, but because he felt the pain of people thousands of miles away. His heart had become so open, so surrendered. that the world's sorrow entered into him like water into a sponge. But he never sank under the weight. He gave it back to God with a smile. Even in the hospital, when he was in agony, he refused morphine, not out of some prideful asceticism, but because he wanted his mind clear for prayer. He wanted to suffer with Christ. He wanted to experience, in his own flesh, the mystery of redemptive pain. He once whispered to a nurse, "My Christ is everything to me. He is my joy, my love, my breath, my light, my peace, my food, my everything." To the modern world, that sounds mad. Joy in illness, peace in pain. But Porphyrios wasn't pretending. He wasn't escaping. He had simply discovered a truth that most people never find. That joy is not found by avoiding suffering, but by going through it with love. And that's what he taught, again and again, to anyone who would listen. "Don't fight the darkness," he would say. "Just turn on the light." That sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. Because most of us spend our lives wrestling with our pain, our fears, our temptations, always resisting, always pushing back. Porphyrios didn't believe in spiritual warfare as a constant battle with shadows. He believed in falling in love with Christ so completely that the shadows disappear in the brightness. Even in the way he corrected people, he never scolded or condemned. He spoke gently, joyfully, sometimes with humor. One time, a monk confessed to him that he couldn't keep the rule of silence in the monastery. He was always chatting. Porphyrios smiled and said, "That's all right. Just talk to Christ more often. No shame, no guilt, just redirection, loving redirection." He understood the human heart. He knew its longing, its sadness, its confusion. And he met it not with demands, but with joy. A contagious, magnetic, luminous joy that made even the most cynical soul soften. And maybe that's his greatest miracle. Not the healings or the prophecies, but the way he showed that holiness isn't heavy. That sainthood isn't a grim, gray endurance. It's radiant. It's lighthearted. It's filled with laughter and song, even while the body is breaking. That's not a contradiction. That's the mystery of the cross. And when you sat with him, even for 5 minutes, you could feel it. The pain in your chest would ease. The chaos in your mind would quiet. Not because he said anything extraordinary, but because he was extraordinary. Not in power, but in love, in surrender, in joy. And when he died, he didn't want a public funeral. He didn't want honors. He slipped away like he lived. Quietly, joyfully hidden, he left behind no wealth, no titles, no empires. Just light, just peace, just a trail of stories that continue to awaken souls to a joy that cannot be shaken. To most of us, surrender feels like defeat. It sounds like waving a white flag, giving up control, becoming weak. But for St. Porphyrios, surrender wasn't weakness. It was power, quiet, unshakable, divine power. Because when you surrender completely to God, you stop trying to carry a weight you were never meant to lift. You let go of the illusion that you're in charge. And in that letting go, you find something the world cannot give: freedom. Porphyrios didn't just believe in surrender. He embodied it. It wasn't a doctrine. It was the air he breathed. He didn't argue with life. He didn't resist what God allowed. Whether it was sickness, obscurity, betrayal, or exhaustion, he accepted it all with the same calm, trusting gaze. Not because he had no ambition, but because his only ambition was Christ. This surrender started young. He left home as a teenager, not for rebellion, but for love. And that love only grew deeper the more he disappeared from the world's spotlight. He didn't fight to be seen. He didn't cling to titles or platforms. In fact, when the church officially recognized his spiritual gifts and gave him responsibilities he never asked for, he accepted them, but always with reluctance, always with humility. He once said, "Do not struggle with temptation. Turn your gaze to Christ and let him do the work." That was his way. He didn't believe in spiritual battles fought by willpower. He believed in immersion, throwing yourself into the ocean of Christ until the enemy couldn't find you anymore. That's not passivity. That's faith at its most dangerous. The kind of faith that can't be manipulated because it wants nothing but God. This is what shocked people when they met him. He wasn't intense or severe. He was disarmingly gentle. He didn't preach fire. He offered peace. And yet, behind that softness was like steel, not willpower over others, but will surrender to God. His strength didn't come from pushing through. It came from yielding, again and again, until even his breath became a prayer. And because he was surrendered, he was free. Free to listen deeply. Free to love without agenda. Free to be misunderstood without needing to defend himself. That's why people poured their hearts out to him. Because they knew he wasn't trying to fix them. He was simply present. Fully, radically, lovingly present. Even in the face of evil, Porphyrios didn't react with fear. There are accounts of him sensing demonic oppression in someone's life and responding not with exorcisms or panic, but with calm, confident prayer. He knew where the power was. He knew who was in charge. And it wasn't him. That's what surrender does. It doesn't make you passive. It anchors you in reality. He once told someone, "You must let Christ take over. Only then will you find rest." And that wasn't poetic language. That was hard-won truth. Because Porphyrios didn't just surrender to God in prayer. He surrendered in everything. When he was too sick to speak, he surrendered his silence. When he was blind in one eye, he offered his blindness. When cancer ravaged his body, he turned even that into a prayer. And through that surrender, he found authority, not the kind the world respects, but the kind heaven listens to. When he prayed for someone, things changed, not because he was powerful, but because he was empty enough for God's power to flow through him like water through a clean pipe. People often came to him asking for advice on how to live a holy life, expecting a list of rules. He would smile and say, "Love Christ." That was it. Not fix yourself, not fight harder. Just love him, trust him, give him your weakness, your fear, your past. Let him carry it. Let him transform it. And in doing so, you'll become a living temple. And he practiced what he preached. Near the end of his life, knowing his death was approaching, he returned to Mount Athos, to the same hermitage where he began as a boy. No fanfare, no goodbyes, just silence and surrender. He asked to die hidden, unknown, forgotten by the world, just him and Christ. And that's how he passed, like a candle burning quietly in the dark, unnoticed by many, but illuminating the world. Even his death was an act of freedom. He had nothing left to cling to, because he had given everything away long before: his comfort, his reputation, his body, his will. And in that total surrender, he became more himself than ever, not a shadow, but a flame. This is what the saints understand that we often miss. That real freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's being so united to God that your desires are purified, your will is aligned, and your soul finally rests. Porphyrios didn't need to chase anything. He had already found the only thing worth having. He was free. Free to love. Free to serve. Free to disappear. And in that disappearing, the light only grew. He didn't write books. He didn't lead armies. He never founded a movement or shouted in the streets. St. Porphyrios of Kafsokalivia lived a life that, on the surface, could seem forgettable, hidden in remote cells, cloaked in silence, lost in prayer. And yet, his life continues to ripple through time with more force than the loudest sermons. His holiness wasn't built on spectacle. It was a revolution of presence, a quiet revolution. That's what the world so often overlooks. It looks for heroes in the spotlight. It celebrates charisma, strategy, power. But the kingdom of God works differently. In God's economy, the unseen holds more weight than the seen. The whispered prayer in a hospital room can move more than 1,000 speeches. The heart broken open by surrender can do more damage to evil than 1,000 battles. And Porphyrios? He was that whisper, that broken open heart, that secret earthquake. There's something frighteningly beautiful about someone who has nothing to prove. Porphyrios never tried to impress. He never insisted on being heard. And yet when he spoke, people listened because there was something in him, something that wasn't from here. His words didn't carry force. They carried weight. They didn't echo with opinion. They resonated with eternity. He once said that the soul becomes holy not by forcing itself, but by being drawn to beauty, drawn to Christ. That was his whole life. He didn't compel people to change. He attracted them, like light attracts the cold, like water draws the thirsty. And people came. They came from cities, from mountains, from prisons of despair and doubt. They came with questions, with guilt, with longing, and he gave them no formula, only Christ. It was enough, and that's the legacy. Not miracles, though they happened, not prophecies, though they were real. His legacy is the awakening, the quiet spiritual revolution he sparked in the hearts of ordinary people. Men and women who had grown numb from religion as routine were suddenly set on fire by a holiness that felt alive. He reminded them, reminds us, that sainthood isn't unreachable, that God isn't distant, that grace is not a prize for the perfect, but a river for the thirsty. He didn't want attention. He fled from it. Even when his reputation grew, when people called him a living saint, he only smiled and called himself a worm. And he meant it, not because he hated himself, but because he saw the holiness of God so clearly, so deeply, that everything else faded. He once said, "I do not want people to say that I am a saint. I only want them to fall in love with Christ." That's it. That was his mission. And what a mission it was. In the stillness of his cell, he changed lives. In the silence of his suffering, he carried nations. His death was unnoticed by the world's headlines, but noticed in heaven. And now he is everywhere. His name whispered in monasteries and hospitals, his icons hanging in homes that once knew only despair. People read his words and cry, not because they're eloquent, but because they are true. Because in Porphyrios, we see what we're meant to be. Not perfect, not powerful, but empty enough for grace to flood in. His story teaches us that holiness isn't for the few. It's for anyone willing to fall in love with Christ so deeply that everything else becomes small. That's the quiet revolution. Not a new theology, not a new movement, but a return to the beauty of God, the sweetness of surrender, the joy of suffering well, and the power of being unseen. Porphyrios didn't need a platform to change the world. He only needed Christ. And in clinging to him completely, he became more than a monk. He became a flame, soft, still impossible to ignore. A flame that spreads quietly, from heart to heart, soul to soul, long after the man himself is gone. And so the revolution continues, not with noise, but with light